John for coming up from Chicago to be here. And thank you as well to Arlene and Jeff Kojal for sponsoring the talk tonight. So quick introduction to John. John is the curator of birds at the Field Museum in Chicago. He grew up in Arizona, got his bachelor's and master's degrees in the University of Arizona, PhD at Louisiana State University, and then a postdoc at the American Museum of Natural History in New York before going to the Field Museum. He has traveled the world studying the evolutionary biology of birds, and so it's a really wonderful thing to have him here tonight. In January, John, along with other researchers and a crew, boarded a sailboat and traveled from the Falkland Islands to the Antarctic Peninsula and the island of South Georgia to study penguin colonies. And we get to hear about his trip tonight, the beautiful landscapes, the incredible creatures that live in those harsh and gorgeous landscapes, and I think a little bit more too. So, John, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you, Arlene and Jeff, for bringing me up here. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been here once before, and it was a number of years ago. I'm seeing that this meeting is, let me see what.
Try to see
What's that?
just try it.
Okay. Oh, you got, I couldn't find my cursor. There it is. Can we, actually, if I do it. There it is. Ah, thank you. Woo! There you go. Okay. This is interesting. So how do I advance it? Okay. Let's start here. So I am a curator of birds at the Field Museum. This is our current slogan, Earth, we're on it. And I've spent a lot of time on this earth, and I've spent a lot of time in areas like South America, various parts of North America and Africa. And as you were told, in January of this year, I was privileged to get a completely different perspective on that. Which is, if you turn the earth and come at it from the south and look at it, you get a very different perspective. This is a land of ice and snow and water and rock, and it's a completely different part of the world, and it was a real pleasure to get to go there. And I want to point out to you that this was in January of this year, which is the austral summer. This is what's going on in Evanston, Illinois during February of this year. And I have permission of my wife, who's my fellow curator at the Field Museum too, to show that picture. And then that's Lake Schwamo, went from an airplane as I was going to the UK to catch a British Airways or a British Air Force flight down to the Falkland Islands. And of course, all of this happened at a time where we all know there was a pandemic going on. We were testing each other all the time. We actually had the trip potentially completely jeopardized by having to quarantine in the Falklands. We were able to convince people that we had a way to do that by going to Antarctica first, as opposed to going to South Georgia. And amazingly enough, it all worked out. This is the crew. There are 9 researchers on this trip. I'll get into who they are in a little bit. But we all met up at this Bryce Norton Air Force Base outside of Heathrow Airport in the middle of the night to catch this British Air Force flight down to the Falklands. And then from the Falklands, we took a bus from the Air Force Base to Stanley, the capital, and we got on this boat. And this boat is called the Vinson of Antarctica. And first, let me ask, has anybody been to Antarctica before? I'm going to guess there might be at least someone who has. So most people go to Antarctica on these big boats. And we had money from the Pritzker Fund for Meteoritics and Polar Studies at the Field Museum to do this trip. And what we did was we chartered a boat called the Vinson of Antarctica, which is a sailboat. And it's a sailboat that is the life's vision of this amazing guy named Skip Novak, who runs pelagic expeditions. And if anybody here is a sailor, there's a reasonable chance that you actually heard Skip's name. I've run into plenty of sailors since I went on this trip who immediately say, "You went to the Antarctic? Did you go with Skip Novak?" And the answer is no, but we went on his boat. And this is a special boat called the Vinson of Antarctica that they built just a few years ago in Norway, specially designed for high latitude sailing. And it's a 77-foot boat. And again, there were 9 researchers and 3 crew members. And we left from Stanley. And this is what the trip looks like. And I'll go through this. Well, this is what it looks like on the boat the first night. What I can say to you is I've been a lot of places doing field work. I've never eaten as well as I did on this trip. The gentleman on the right there that you can just barely see, who cooked the squid dinner that we had on the first night, has written his own cookbook. He's one of the 3 crew members. All 3 crew members cooked. So this was a spectacular way to do this. And then there was this guy in the harbor who was leaving by himself on a sailboat, and he had a lamb hung up on the back of his boat. So that's why I took the picture. But he'll come back later in the talk, I promise. So here's where we're going to go. So this is an amazing part of the world. We're starting in the Falklands up in the upper left, and we're going to go down to the Antarctic Peninsula, and then we're going to come back to South Georgia. And these are all eBird lists that we made along the way that are on a trip report on eBird. And so if anybody's interested, you can see more photos there. But this is about the same distance as going from Chicago to New Orleans to Denver, and Denver back to Chicago. So it's quite a long ways. Latitudinally wise, the southern point of the trip, or in this case, if you were looking at it from the other direction, would be like starting at the US-Canadian border and going north. And again, it's austral summer down there. And then, of course, almost everybody knows something about Ernest Shackleton. And so I like to put this map up to show you that while we weren't following in Shackleton's footsteps per se, because the Endurance was going around the east side of the Antarctic Peninsula, and we were going on the west side, we did actually mirror his trip from the Antarctic Peninsula to South Georgia, which is the thing he did in that small boat in order to save his crew. And once you get out in the Antarctic, in this part of the Drake Passage, or the Scotia Sea as it's called, it's a 5-day trip on this sailboat to get to the Antarctic Peninsula. And immediately you start seeing this group of birds, the Procellariforms, which are just a spectacular group of birds, which as a kid growing up in Arizona, I just dreamt about. So this is a giant petrel, a southern giant petrel. This is a dark phase one, which could be an immature. Here's an adult. This is a south plumage petrel in the genus Pterodroma. There are 38 species of Pterodroma petrels now. I'll get into a little bit about what's going on with these seabirds later on. This is an Antarctic prion, which is a group of, again, about 8 or 9 species that are found all over these circumpolar areas. And they nest on these islands that are scattered across the entire Antarctic region. And of course, the thing you're really hoping to see when you get out here, which I had never seen a member of the family before, is an albatross. And these are these spectacular gliders, and there are multiple species. This is black-browed albatross. This is gray-headed albatross. I'll come back to this later because they breed on South Georgia. This is light-mantled albatross, a beautiful blackish bird that to coal-colored with this beautiful white eye line. And then, of course, the bird that you really want to see is wandering albatross. And you get out in the open ocean, and suddenly these incredible birds with 12, 13-foot wingspans are just gliding along the side of the boat. And these are birds that are covering thousands of kilometers on feeding trips during the breeding season to feed their young on things like squid. And every once in a while, you do even get to see them on the water. They actually, they don't dive. They actually find food near the surface and then land to feed most of the time. And after about 5 days or so, you've crossed the Scotia Sea, and suddenly you're in between these islands and the Antarctic Peninsula. So the waves are buffered and it's completely calm. And you're in a different world. And what you can see is there's an awful lot of ice, there's an awful lot of rock, there's water, there are humpbacked whales. Those are southern fulmars in the foreground. And it's really exciting. And you keep going south and you start realizing how much ice and snow there are. So if you look at this picture, that's a 4-story tourist boat ahead of us there. And that's what the glacier looks like in front of you. And so it's just an amazing landscape. There are bluish colored glaciers that have come off into the water. You get to places where glacial melt is happening and the water in the right sunlight turns to a brilliant bright blue. And then there's the thing that we're looking for. So we're here to study penguins, and you see your first ones. These are some chin straps sitting on the ice. You see a few more sitting on the ice. And you get a little farther south and then you see something like this in the distance, and you can see the mountains in the background, but there's a bare spot on that hill and there's some bare spots on the bottom. And as you get a little closer, you can start seeing these little lines going up the ridges. And these are Gentoo penguins. These are Antarctic Gentoo penguins. And we're here because of the research work that a set of women were doing that were the leaders of this trip. And they're shown here. Jane Younger was the person who came up with the idea, came to me and said, John, I'd like to see if we could write a grant proposal to the Polar Studies folks to see if they'd let us go to Antarctica. And I said, I'll support that as long as I get to go. Rachel Herman is a graduate student. Jane is at the University of Tasmania now. She just took a position there. Rachel Herman is at Stony Brook. She's working on the population genetics of Antarctic Gentoo penguins. Sushma Reddy is the curator of birds at the Bell Museum in Minneapolis. Gemma Klukas is a postdoc at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in New York and has studied penguins her entire career. And then in the foreground is Katie O'Brien, and she's a master's student at the University of Bath in the UK, and she's studying fecal samples of penguins to understand diet changes over time. And this is the group, and then there were 4 of us guys who were all basically hangers-on, helping to hold penguins while we were bleeding them and helping to gather fecal samples and stuff. And this is one of the primary reasons, research-wise, that Sushma and Jane and Gemma were so excited to get down here. In 2020, they published a paper that looked at the genetic data for Gentoo penguins from South Georgia, the Falkland Islands, and the Antarctic Peninsula. And then you can also see they had samples from Kerguelen Island, which is all the way over on the other side of the continent of Antarctica. And what they showed is that these samples and actually genetic or morphologic work they did were showing distinctive populations, meaning that the populations on South Georgia, Falklands, and the Antarctic Peninsula and Kerguelen were all genetically and morphologically distinct from one another. And so they recognized that they felt like they should be called 4 different species. And this is happening with a lot of seabirds. I didn't mention this when I showed you a wandering albatross, but it turns out wandering albatross breed in several different islands across all around Antarctica. And there are about 7 different populations. And the genetic work on those animals also shows that they're genetically distinct. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on is in this part of the Antarctic, what it clearly shows you is there's a really strong penalty for not getting back to the place you were born. And so once you start a colony someplace, it's very clear that there's a very strong homing ability on these birds. And that's pretty amazing given that birds like wandering albatrosses may be out at sea for something like 7 years before they reach sexual maturity and actually come back to breed. So one of the things you have to do in this area, you're the only people around for hundreds of miles most of the time. The crew is very good at advising you to be very thoughtful and careful about all your preparations to go on shore. Here's the group getting ready in some of the islands off the coast of it, some of the Antarctic islands off the coast of the peninsula. And here are the birds we're going after. And I was excited to see penguins. I'd seen penguins in some other places like South Africa and South America before, but seeing them in Antarctica is a whole different thing, and watching them on the ice and snow. And so this is an Antarctic gentoo penguin. They're just cute as can be. And then the place you're looking at them as you look around sometimes is just absolutely mind-boggling. And so the boat has a zodiac. We blow the zodiac up when we get to the place that we want to work. You come on shore. That red stuff in the foreground is all is all penguin guano. And this is where we would be able to work at these colonies for as long as we needed to do the sampling we wanted to do. And no matter what you've heard about penguins, I'd actually argue that they're almost as curious about you as you are about them. And this is Herbie Lovett. He's one of the professors at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, being checked out by an Antarctic gentoo penguin. There are actually plenty of mammals around too. This is a wet-tailed seal, and I can tell you that this wet-tailed seal was sleeping on this chunk of ice around one of the gentoo colonies. And this is the 30 seconds that he raised his head in the entire 6 hours we were there. He could care less that we were there. I mentioned that one of the reasons why we were here is to look at diet. And one of the primary dietary items of these penguins in this part of the world, so along in the Antarctic Ocean, is krill, which is a crustacean that lives in gigantic numbers and forms the basis of the marine ecosystem in this region. And so we were getting fecal samples at every colony. Now, one of the things you're going to see as I go along in this talk and we transfer from place to place is the nesting substrates changed a little bit. And that's really interesting with respect to these gentoo penguins, which Gemma and Sushma and Jane are arguing are 4 different species. Those aren't the only species of penguins that you run into. There are chinstrap penguins, which is sort of it's not a fully Antarctic penguin, but it's a penguin that's on the Antarctic Peninsula and then gets to some of the islands further north. And they're just a spectacular plumage bird, really beautiful. And around the colonies, when you get around them, they're really noisy. And they're all, we were down there during the breeding season. So penguins are monogamous. The males and females take turns incubating the eggs, going out and feeding and coming back and feeding the chicks. And so it's just an absolutely amazing landscape to get to these places, get on shore, and then start doing the work we're doing around these penguin colonies. Here's another species, and this was one that we were hoping to encounter, but weren't necessarily sure that we were going to, which is a Adelie penguin. It's, along with emperor penguin, are the 2 most Antarctic of the penguins. So they're most tied to the main continent of Antarctica, but Adelie penguin gets quite a ways up the peninsula in small numbers. And so we found a few, and some of them mixed in with the gentoos and chinstraps in these colonies. And they have one of the most amazing features to me. Their eyes are actually at the level of their bill. And I'm still trying to figure out if I can find another bird that actually is set up like that. They're just absolutely beautiful. There are things other than penguins. These are Antarctic shags. Antarctic shags are basically just double-crested cormorants from the Antarctic. And so, except they have some really beautiful eye rings and these carbuncles on their nose. So I want to try to see that. We'll see whether this works. I'm not sure the sound will be there, but I wanted to give you an idea, because the other thing you want to remember is that penguins are aquatic things that come up onto land to breed. And I think that was the hardest thing for me to appreciate. But when you get to see them moving around in the water, you begin to realize that this is what they do most of the time. And then they come up to breed and feed their young only when they really have to. And so just getting a chance in these completely amazing spaces where there's nobody else around to watch these penguins just foraging in the shallows here, but also recognizing that they go out to the open ocean, is just incredible. And you often see them in groups like this, and there's a good reason for that, safety in numbers. This is a leopard seal. This thing has a head about this big, and they can literally in seconds turn a penguin, basically skin a penguin. They just grab them, shake them, and pull the body out and then leave the skin. And we saw several across the area. It's a very interesting animal. Its biology is still really poorly known, but it's part of this ecosystem. And one of the things that's interesting about this ecosystem is you've got these predators and prey, and then of course you've got scavengers. And this is an Antarctic South Polar skua. It's one of the scavengers. This is southern snowy sheathbill, which is another scavenger. And they look like a cross between a pigeon and a gull, I guess. And they're literally everywhere around these colonies, just sort of taking care of anything that happens to die. And they're very good at doing this. And you'll see they're not the only ones. There are also giant petrels that hang around these colonies, and I'll come back to those later on. So we're in the nesting season. One of the things I want you to notice is that as the summer goes on and as we go to places further north on this trip, you'll see the chicks are going to get bigger. So here are Gentoo penguins on with some really small chicks on the outer islands on the Antarctic Peninsula. Yeah, there we go. And then if you're going to make a trip like this, one of the things you try to do is get as much data as possible. I already mentioned that we put in eBird lists all along for people to understand the censuses and the numbers of birds that we were seeing. This is Jacob Cooper, who's a graduate student at the University of Kansas now, but he used to be a graduate student at the University of Chicago. He was recording sounds along the way to archive vocalizations from everything we could get access to. And then the penguin community is actually a fairly tight-knit group of people that even though they're scattered around the world, have maintained communication with one another. But like everybody else during COVID, they were having trouble getting to places. And so this is Gemma and Bryce Johnson, who's a graduate student at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, putting new batteries in these cameras that are set up remotely to take a daily picture of what it looks like around these penguin colonies. And that allows researchers to get a handle about what's going on a day-to-day basis during the beginning of the breeding season, into the breeding season, and onward. And these are really important aspects of trying to monitor things. So the other thing that's fascinating is once you've done this, you start paying attention to the literature. And we got back, and in February of 2020, a paper came out that basically said that research was showing that black carbon, which comes from engines landing on the ice, was actually, or on the snow, was actually reducing the amount of snow on the Antarctic Peninsula by as much as an inch in many places. And that's the result of tourism and research. And so it's easy to forget that as much as you're doing everything you can to try to minimize your impact, there's still an aspect of that going on. And that's one of the interesting things about this part of the world, is that researchers are definitely trying to monitor all these kinds of aspects of impact as time goes on. And so this was a really interesting message to me associated with that. All right, so we've been to the Antarctic Peninsula. We're going to go back across the Scotia Sea now. And as we get out in the sea, one thing, again, I can't help but emphasize is how pelagic penguins really are. And once you've seen a set of penguins moving through water like it's nothing when your boat is rocking quite a bit, you get a real handle for just how special they are. And of course, people always ask, do you get sick on these trips? And the answer is yes. And the good news is you get better. But so we would have a lot of time together in close quarters, and we got along very well. But I wanted to show you what it looks like on these boats on a day when it's rocking. And the boat is designed really well. So notice there's an armature on that pressure cooker that allows the pressure cooker to move with the rocking of the boat. And as this goes on, it's going to cut across to Bryce Johnson, who's an absolutely amazing artist who's working on a penguin drawing as I took this video. That's Kenneth, one of the mates. And here's Bryce. No problem. That's a Gentoo penguin head he's working on. And then I'm going to cut to the window because I just want to show you kind of what's going on outside. And what you're going to see is the boat is moving up and down, and eventually you're going to see blue-green water. And that's because the water is going up over that window. And so we actually had a very pleasant passage, according to the crew. But it does get rough out there. But again, after about 5 days, you're suddenly around the north side of South Georgia, and you're in this spectacular harbor looking at this completely different landscape. We're now a lot farther north. We're still south of what's called the polar front, which is we're still in Antarctic waters. So the Falkland Islands are actually across the polar front. And this is why we went on this trip in a lot of ways, is because we were able to charter this boat, and then we were able to visit all these different sites to work on the penguins that these researchers wanted to sample. And what I want to emphasize is how hard it is for them a lot of other times, because it's not cheap to get down here. And a lot of times they'll sell their skills, or they'll give their skills to the tour boats. And by getting down there, they can get a few days in a given place to get a little research done while they're on the tour boat. But this was a trip where we were entirely focused on getting on shore, getting what we wanted to do. And so we were able to stop at about 6 or 7 sites across the northern side of South Georgia Island. And let me bring up Ernest Shackleton here, because this is what South Georgia looks like. It's covered in mountains and glaciers. Shackleton, when he left Elephant Island and sailed across the Scotia Sea to get to South Georgia, landed on the south side of South Georgia, and then had to cross these mountains to get to the whaling stations on the north side. And to me, that's almost as unimaginable as crossing the Scotia Sea the way they did. This is the only one of these stations that's still has people. It's the only inhabited place in South Georgia. It's called Grytviken. It's a museum. Again, this year, half of the tour companies didn't run any tour boats. The other half that did ran half full, and a lot of them still had issues with COVID. So there were very few people coming into places like Grytviken this year, which again, just led to additional aspects of the isolation, which was just amazing to be part of. Again, it's an old whaling station. Thousands and thousands of whales, fur seals were killed from the late 1800s into as late as 1950. They were still operating at least one of these stations. And so it's easy to think about what kind of effects humans have had. This is Ernest Shackleton's grave site at Grytviken, is on the left. I have to say I was more sort of stunned by this little plaque for the only fatality in the 1982 Falklands War from South Georgia, which was an Argentinian seaman who got shot once by mistake, actually. And you're just thinking, like, really, people were fighting over a place like this, so far away and so isolated? But then, of course, humans bring other things too. So this is a native plant called green burnet, I think, or polar, yeah, I can't remember the common name, but right in the middle of it is a dandelion. And dandelions have covered the globe thanks to humans. Rats and mice are another big problem. And actually, if you look at the tour books about South Georgia from 2000, what they'll tell you is that most of many of the breeding birds, particularly the 2 endemic non-oceanic birds, are actually only being seen out on the outer islands where there are no mice and rats. But it turns out in 2000, they started a massive campaign to get rid of mice and rats, and they were able to do it. And so one of the things that was really stunning to us was watching what the effects of that are. I also mentioned fur seals. So fur seals are now, in spite of the fact that they were caught, so common that as we go on shore, we're required to bring sticks with us basically to ward them off. And this is what it looks like when you're on shore. You've got adults and you've got pups, and they're literally just in every single direction. And it's an incredible sound. I don't know if we'll be able to hear this, but let me. We can't. It's not playing, but they have these pups are just littering the shore and just making all these little yelping sounds 24 hours a day. And they're absolutely beautiful. And you'll see this is a king penguin. I'll come back to king penguins in a second. But he's just, this is what it looks like when you're on shore. Everything just sort of ignores everything else, and they're just kind of figuring things out. This king penguin's going to walk over to another group of king penguins. And you'll notice that a number of them will actually have funny tufts of fur. And I'll come back to that in a second too, because king penguin breeding biology is really spectacular. There's more and more fur seals, and there's some king penguins. And again, they're just checking you out. So I mentioned that there were non-oceanic birds on South Georgia. This is the southernmost passerine bird in the world, the southernmost songbird. This is a South Georgia pipit. And again, this was decimated by the rats and mice, such that they were breeding on the offshore islands. We saw them everywhere we stopped. And so they've come back, and they're now in big numbers. This is the endemic South Georgia pintail. Same thing. We saw groups of up to 80 or so on the mainland. And so they're clearly doing just fine now. And one of the things that's kind of funny is realizing that they're depending on the penguin colonies as much as anything else is. There's only one species of insect in South Georgia. It's this little fly, and they hang around in big numbers around the penguin colonies. And so you can see in the foreground here, you've got a South Georgia pintail, and then right next to it is a South Georgia pipit. So there are other things up on the beaches. Now we're looking at southern elephant seals. These are actually young southern elephant seals. They come up this time of year to just shed their skin. Every once in a while, they get a little angry with one another. And they're an incredible sight to see, but most of the time they're literally just out there on the beach, just going through this molt that they go through. All right, if you'll remember back to the beginning of the talk, I showed you that guy leaving Stanley Harbor with a lamb on the back of his boat. He's a guy named Leif Ponset. He's the son of the leading conservation biologist from the Falklands in South Georgia. Her name's Sally Ponset. And he sailed by himself to South Georgia and was spending the entire summer going around South Georgia on his own. Turns out he knows our captain. He comes on board one night and he says to us, as we're eating dinner, he says, you ornithologists, I've got a picture of a bird I took when I was traveling between the Falklands and South Georgia. We said, oh, he goes, yeah, it was yellow with a gray back. I have no idea what it was. We didn't think much of it. The next morning as he was leaving, he came back to say goodbye to the crew, came on board, he pulls out his phone and he shows me a picture of this. I'm guessing there are enough birders here that know that this is a prothonotary warbler. There's the breeding distribution of prothonotary warbler in yellow and the wintering distribution in blue. And that red arrow is where this picture, where Leif actually had this prothonotary warbler land on his boat. That record is now in eBird. It created a little bit of a stir. And it just shows you that birds can do amazing things when they get up and go. So we're further north now. There are almost no plants on the Antarctic Peninsula. Now you've got lichens and bryophytes of all kinds. And the other thing we're doing in these colonies is census work. And this was primarily Gemma Klukas and Irby Lovett from Cornell who got their drone license and then would fly drones over the colonies taking pictures. And what you can see on this is a chinstrap penguin colony on the far east end of South Georgia. And Gemma's tiled together the photos there of what the colony looks like. And there are probably upwards of 700, 800 pairs of birds on this colony. And then at the same site, I want to show you what the Gentoo penguins are doing. Remember, those Gentoo penguins that I showed you in the Antarctic were going up those snow fields to get to the top of this plateau that where there was enough dirt where snow had melted such that they could put their nests in. And in this case, we're getting ready to land on South Georgia, and you can see there are elephant seals in the foreground, there are fur seals in the foreground, there's some king penguins. And then if you look at the very top of this green up here, you'll see a little bit of white up there. And that's a Gentoo penguin colony. And those birds are going up and down this valley, back and forth to go out to feed and come back and feed their young. And this is what it looks like in the other direction. And what you can see here, also in the background there, is the only tour boat we saw the entire time, other than those smaller ones down in the Antarctic Peninsula. This is a French boat that was here for probably 4 hours or so before it headed out and went south. Now we're going to run into some other penguins now. I call this the toucan of the penguin world. It's a macaroni penguin, and it's in the genus Eudiptes. And Eudiptes, as we'll see later on, are penguins that like to nest up on really steep rocky slopes. And here's a colony of them. It's probably got about 700 pairs. The weather at this site was so wet and rainy that we decided it wasn't safe to go up the slope that these penguins are actually going up and down to feed their chicks. And then if you look to the right-hand side there, you can actually see some more white dots out there. And those are breeding gray-headed albatrosses. And those are chicks. And again, what's going on here is they've only got often, in general, one chick a year. And they go out on these long feeding trips with one of the adults hanging around. The chicks at this time are big enough that some of them were by themselves. And macaroni parents are just like other penguin parents. They're very attentive. You can see the chicks are starting to get big now. You certainly aren't going to sit on a chick like that if you're an adult. People ask if penguins are aggressive to one another, and the answer is most of the time, no. This is actually just two birds side by side just screaming at one another. They're not really actually pecking at one another. Now, again, we're not going to have sound here, I don't think, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, this is a Gentoo colony. You can see they're also very good at squirting fecal material away from the nest. That's a good thing health-wise. And they'll do these calls and these stereotype behaviors, which is essentially a way of pair bonding. I'm going to go on to the macaroni here. Look at the substrate here. The substrate is this really wet, rocky habitat, and that's what macaronis penguins actually look for. Now, how you got the evolution of that, I can't tell you. But you'll also notice that they aren't particularly concerned by the fact that they're there. And again, I don't think they really see humans as anything other than object and things that happen to show up that way. But these stereotype behaviors are just absolutely wonderful. All right. If you had to ask me what my favorite penguin was, it would be king penguin. Only because it's just one of the most majestic birds I've ever seen. They're really cool. Again, just like any other penguin, they're not worried about you particularly. They're out there doing their own thing. I don't know what these guys are talking about. They are interacting with all the other wildlife. This is one I caught on this stream this one time. What do you do when there's a young southern elephant seal cutting off your way forward? I guess you wait and hope that he decides this. But the other thing about king penguins in South Georgia is that they live in these big colonies. And when I say big colonies, I mean big colonies. This colony has over 50,000 pairs of birds. And the other thing about this is king penguins' biology is fascinating. They lay an egg at a time, the chick hatches, and then it takes over a year before that chick is actually ready to go into the ocean. So they're actually sitting on land all the way through the winter on South Georgia. And the adults may or may not be able to come and feed them regularly. And so they've evolved an incredible thing, a fur coat, basically, made of feathers. And that's what they look like. And they have this beautiful whistled call that they do to attract their parents. But then they actually have to molt into adult plumage. And doing that must be an incredible process because none of these molting birds look very happy. They look like really unhappy birds. And so I still am marveling at the idea of going back and forth to the ocean for 10 to 12 months, coming ashore and actually trying to find your mate, your chick, in 100,000 birds on these shores, and yet they're clearly capable of doing it. And again, as we're doing this work, every once in a while you look in the background and you realize that you're in one of the most gorgeous areas scenery-wise I've ever been to. Now, I mentioned predation earlier. We didn't see actual predation events, but we certainly saw the results of predation events. This was actually a live king penguin that we saw when we went on shore, one of the first places we went. And what I want you to notice is the head of the bird to the right of it, which is a giant petrel. And the minute that giant petrel saw the wound on this king penguin, it was trying to peck at the bird and basically do it in. And so you start realizing that this is the kind of things that happen all the time in this part of Antarctica. And the giant petrels are an incredible part of this ecosystem. They're scared of putting their heads in absolutely nothing. This is a very dead fur seal carcass, and this giant petrel is just absolutely coating itself with goop. It seems very happy about it. But for us as museum scientists, Susma Reddy and I weren't really prepared for the fact that we could actually do some salvaging and bring back specimens for the museum that we work for. And we were able to do that, which was going to be really valuable in lots of cases because we don't have very many modern specimens of these species of penguins. All right, the last place we're going to go is the Falkland Islands. We've come all the way back, and the Falkland Islands are now north of the polar front. They're 300 miles off the coast of South America. They're historically connected. They're on the same geologic plate as South America, South America. And what you can see here is they're full of British people who raise sheep. And the sheep is actually on the logo for the islands. They're still part of the British Protectorate. And because of that, they haven't really gotten rid of their mice, their rats, and that's a real problem on the main parts of the big islands in the Falklands. So almost all the endemic birds there are 12 species of endemic birds, are actually forced off of the main islands, or you're most likely to see them on smaller islands. And we went to a place called Sea Lion Island, which is the southernmost inhabited island in the Falklands. And this is a striated caracara, which again is an endemic species. There are several species of ducks now that are very similar to populations on South America. This is a Falkland steamer duck. Some of these populations actually have lost the ability to fly. This is a kelp goose, the genus Cleophaga, and there are two other species in the area. And then you start seeing things like, this is an austral thrush. So this is the same genus as our American robin. And it even looks like an American robin, but it's an endemic species on the Falklands. You get species of South American birds. This is a little bird called white-bridled finch, which is only found on the southern cone of South America, but a population's got out and established itself in the Falklands. Red-breasted meadowlark is sort of the same thing. And then I'm guessing people know what this is. This is a black-crowned night heron. Black-crowned night herons are actually on basically every continent except Antarctica. And given that they've reached the Falklands, it wouldn't surprise me that someday they actually get to Antarctica. But this is considered to be an endemic species. And then, of course, you can always talk about predators in various ways. One of the things I was hoping to see was killer whale. And we were on Sea Lion Island and we saw these fur seals that were clearly nervous. And one of them actually had a little bit of damage on the back of its, one of its back flippers. And we were looking at them and suddenly one of the people in our group yells, "Killer whales." And this pod of two adults and 2 juveniles cruises into the harbor, and it's absolutely clear that what they're doing is tracking these 2 fur seals and just hoping that they'll go back into the water and try to make a run for it. But of course, there are penguins here too. So now we're going to get into a different set of penguins, except we aren't. The first one is Gentoo penguin, which is just like we've seen in the other places. But now look at where they are. They're nesting in tussock grass up on the shore. And also, what I told you about the season going on, the chicks are really big, and it's now leading to a keystone cop type thing where the chicks are actually chasing adults around trying to get them to feed. And so that's telling you basically that the adults are probably going to take off and go to sea before too long, and the chicks are going to have to decide what they're going to do in terms of feeding themselves and actually go into the ocean. So here's one of the other species, Magellanic penguin. This is in the genus Spheniscus, which is the northernmost group of penguins. So there's Spheniscus penguins on the Galapagos. They're in South Africa, and they're also on the coast of South America. And this is Magellanic penguin. And then finally, the last species is another species of Eudyptes like macaroni penguin. And what this is southern rockhopper penguin doing what they do. And they're incredibly cool, punk-looking birds. But when you see where they breed, it's absolutely breathtaking. So this is a cliff on the northeast shore of Sea Lion Island. That's probably about 100 meters above the ocean. There's a tiny little crevasse, and these rockhopper penguins literally hop up this every time they go out to feed or leave the colony. All right, well, I'm going to stop there. And I guess what I want to leave you with is, there's a lot of people to thank. We had amazing support from the various governments that we worked with as part of this. That's the South Georgia government, the Falkland government, and the US government getting permission for the work we did in Antarctica. And again, these 9 species of penguins were absolutely spectacular to work with. They're only about 23 species of penguins in the entire world. So we were able to experience and sample a number of a good proportion of them. And then, this last picture is of a Magellanic penguin getting ready to go out into the ocean. And for me, it was just recognizing that, these birds are down here doing what they do. And they're still being influenced by humans and human activity. And I sure hope that one of the things that happens is that we begin to all work together and figure out ways to make sure that these penguins continue to do this for another 20 million years. I mean, they've been doing this for a long time. And I'll stop there and take any questions. Thanks. Yeah.
Do they have any parasites, external or internal?
Good question. Yes. Do they have any parasites?
She didn't hear the question.
Yeah, the question was, do they have any parasites? And they do have parasites, and they've been looked at extensively by some of the other researchers over the years. But I still think there's probably a lot to learn, and that especially if you've got things like expanding into new habitats, what all that means. And we can do a little bit of that sometimes by working with the fecal samples, and actually, with blood samples. But I don't think, one thing I don't think they have is I don't know that they have malaria parasites. Although, again, that may not be true if we're talking about things like Humboldt penguin up in the Galapagos. Yeah.
What is the appeal of cold environment there for penguins? And how do the Galapagos penguins manage to live in these places?
So, great question. So what I'd say is, at some level, we don't know. But at the other hand, I mean, there has been, with genetic work, we can get a good handle on how old penguins are and how they're related. And what's happened is penguins have evolved in the Antarctic region. And I think that's a really interesting thing, because one of the things you can think about is sheathbills, skuas, albatrosses, all these species, if you go back and look at the base of where they have evolved from, they all go back about 20 million years. And so this is an ecosystem that's been present for a long time. If you go back to 45 million years ago, Antarctica was actually a tropical habitat. We know that from the fossil record. And so that all changed when Antarctica got cut off from South America and in Australia. And that's a really stable, long period of time where this little community that's not necessarily very diverse, but it's gotten really specialized. But like anything, as everything will try to speciate. And I think with Galapagos penguins, what you've just gotten is those are cold water habitats all the way up to the Galapagos. And anywhere that cold water has actually extended north along the continental areas, you actually have species in the genus Pheniscus. And so they've adapted to those kinds of habitats. One of the things, they're also the species that are most likely to be in danger. And that's mostly because they just come in closer contact with humans. But at the same time, it may mean that they're more susceptible to climate change if those ocean currents shift.
Coat on the young pink penguin. Is that down or is that a feather with radius?
It's really, it's down, which means by definition, actually, I mean, all feathers have I really want to pull some of these out and look at them, because there can't be much of a radius on them, but they're definitely feathers. And yet I've never seen anything that is less feather-like. If that makes any sense, it's really bizarre. Yeah.
Like as far as the tank, like hang on to the question, like it's like as far as penguins' coats go, how do they stay warm in such a cold, like cold ocean, like they have like a special type of feather?
So that's an interesting question, because their feathers are really small. No, more than anything, I mean, the feathers are certainly have to be helpful, but they've got a thick layer of fat, and they've got a circulatory system that's designed to help keep things internal as much as possible while they're diving. I mean, all these animals have spectacular adaptations for being out in the ocean. And yeah, it's a really different physiology than the average bird that you look at. Yeah, they're off the charts in terms of the kinds of things that they do like that. Yeah.
I have the three questions. Two of them are kind of like, but the first one is how many hours a day do gentry penguins, how many hours a day do they usually search for krill, eat krill? Is it like a 10-hour and a half?
Well, so that
Just two other real quick ones to add on to that. Expelling guano for defense, is that like, I've never seen that before.
it's not defense. What I would say is it's more coming back to the parasite thing. It's kind of getting it away from the nest.
Okay.
And what I would tell you is that when you're in a colony like that, a lot of times if you're expelling guano, you're probably hitting your neighbor's area.
Well, that's
And so it's I didn't show you some pictures, but I could show you some what seemed to be very healthy chicks that were literally covered in guano.
Is that unique to these penguins? Is that unique to the gentry penguins?
In terms of
Expelling guano, like shooting it that far?
no, because actually I can tell you stories from working on in Mexico where ospreys breed, and ospreys actually sit on nests and defecate out. Now, whether the young do that or not, but it's definitely something that birds have evolved to do. Just
Last question was really just related to the camera lens you guys use for all these pictures, because I don't really know anything about this. What millimeters?
Yeah, so Arlene can tell you that I am not a fancy camera person.
Okay, that's fine.
So-
I'll talk
so-
about it.
But I want, so your first question though, what was?
How many hours? I mean, as far as
So remember that we're, I mean, this is an you know, at these high latitudes, you've got 24 hours of daylight. And so that's one of the reasons why they're, in terms of the breeding season, they're getting out. Now with krill's a really interesting thing because krill has diurnal movements, so they can be closer to the surface or farther from the surface. And there may be some real issues, and I don't know how that works actually in the austral summer.
Yeah, so how do they eat in the winter?
So in the winter, they don't. The krill are probably a lot of times they come up at dark when it's dark, so they may be actually easier to get krill.
But it's dark 24 hours a day too.
Yeah, and so you mean how do they see? Is that what you're wondering about? That's an interesting question too. I would guess that's an interesting challenge, and yet penguins routinely dive down to 100 meters when they're foraging.
And I was also going to mention that some of the first people to go deal with the penguins, Aspley Cherry Gerard, you ever heard of his name? He has a book called The Worst Journey in the World. He was with Scott and they went to collect penguin eggs in the wintertime.
So what I would tell you about a bunch of those guys, this I don't want to get myself in trouble, is those guys really didn't know a lot about what they were doing. I mean, I spent a lot of time on the boat between South Georgia and the Falklands, reading Shackleton, one of the biographies of Shackleton, finding out how he wouldn't listen to the Norwegians about dogs. He actually brought a car on one of the trips that he was going to drive across the Antarctica on. I mean, this is like, yeah, I mean,
This book's the youngest guy who went with Scott, so it's a very interesting story.
well,
He's also the one who found Scott's where he died.
yeah. So Scott and Shackleton got scurvy, and the reason they got scurvy is because they wouldn't eat fresh meat. They wouldn't eat penguins and they wouldn't eat sea lions, which the Norwegians had no trouble doing for seals. The Norwegians had no trouble doing that. And just by virtue of doing that, the Norwegians were able to avoid scurvy. Yeah, no, I mean, you really doing it the way we did it, where we've got people who are experts who are telling us what not to do all the time, makes a big difference. And the idea of going down there, I'd like to think I would have never signed up for one of Shackleton's trips. Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
So what precautions did you take when you went from boat into the penguin areas? What precautions did you take so that you were not introducing some?
Good question. So we are scrubbing down. We use a disinfectant to scrub down after we come out of the every time, and so we do that, and then we do the same as we're getting ready to go out. So we're trying to keep stuff as clean as possible and actually avoid things like that. And it's a good question. And I don't think there's much literature on crossing over, but it's a really good point.
Great. Well, thank you very much, John.